Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased that Kathryn Sikkink has joined us today. Kathryn is just a remarkable person and scholar. Some years ago, there was some list of 25 most influential international relations scholars in the US or the world. And she was an obligatory person on that list. She's really a pioneer in the politics of human rights and human rights policy. I think, probably the most prominent scholar in the world on this topic. And she's also been a real leader in constructivist approaches to international relations and to politics. And, sometimes constructivism can be kind of soft, but she brings great evidence and great innovation in thinking about kinds of evidence that one wants to present with constructivist scholarship. She's the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and many other honorary associations, and a great friend and colleague. Thanks so much for joining us.
So first, thank you, Scott, for the invitation and for your hospitality. Great to see you and Sue again. Hi, Anibal. Anibal and I just saw one another in Mexico City. So I was going to sit down, but given that I need to project to the back of the room, I'm going to stand up. And I am presenting today work in progress. Because Sandra and Eva just heard a completely different talk last week, and I thought it wasn't fair to come here and make them sit through the same talk again. And so this is a related but different talk than what you've heard in Mexico City. But also because it's really a paper I'm working on right now with my co-authors, Jeff Dancy from the University of Toronto and Averill Schmidt, former PhD student, now at Cornell University, or soon to be at Cornell University. And we really can benefit from your feedback. Literally, I don't have a full written chapter yet on this. I'm presenting at that stage, but we've done some preliminary analysis, okay? But in order to set the stage for what I'm going to present to you, you need to indulge me because I'm going to engage in some intellectual biography, okay? And I think the intellectual biography is not just self-indulgent, but is helpful maybe to understand the question I'm asking now. And so just, you want to just bear with me a little bit, okay? And I'm going back, really back far, okay? Back in 1980, shortly out of undergraduate, I went to a human rights organization in Washington, D.C. called the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, before I went to graduate school. And I was assigned to work with, I lived in Uruguay during the dictatorship. I was assigned to work with Uruguayan and especially Argentine human rights activists, mainly victims groups, but other groups coming to Washington, D.C. to bring their case before the, what was then, it was the very end of the Carter administration government, okay? And I tell you this because I want to say one thing. Those groups made many demands about what needed to happen in the future and of things they'd like the US government to do and to stop doing. But, and I've dug through all my papers, 1980, Washington, D.C., cells, madres, abuelas, okay, they were not asking for trials. They were not asking for criminal prosecutions of their government officials, okay? 1985, so go forward 5 years, I'm going as a PhD student now to do my dissertation research in Argentina on a totally different topic. It's a book I wrote on developmentalism. And I just happened to be in Buenos Aires the whole year of 1985, which was the year of the trials of the juntas in Argentina. I was able to go, the public could go and attend. I was a couple of times able to attend the trials. I was able to meet again with some of the human rights activists I had known at the time back in 1980 at WOLA. And so there's kind of the question, what happened between 1981, when no one was talking about trials, in 1985, a short time later, where there was not just a demand for trials, but there were these very important trials of the 9 junta members that led the Argentine government. Okay. Now, you know, I wasn't working on that issue at the time, but this planted some seeds in my mind and also things I went back to later. So then in 2011, okay, I published this book, The Justice Cascade, that took this up. But I actually want to say in 2001, so really a decade before this, I wrote my first article that used the term justice cascade. This article with my co-author, Ellen Lutz, and it was just about foreign prosecutions. We actually used the term first to talk about the Pinochet. If the Pinochet had been arrested in London, it was a big deal to talk about this emergence of these foreign human rights prosecutions. Ellen Lutz had been a litigator, and she had worked on other trials, like a trial against Suarez Mason, another Argentine general, a trial against the Marcos family in the Philippines. So we saw it wasn't just Pinochet, there was a series of interesting foreign human rights trials going on. And so we coined this term, the justice cascade, and I coined it from the work of norm scholars. In particular, it was Cass Sunstein, a legal scholar, who had talked about norm cascades, okay? And so I, we sort of said, oh, norms cascade, we will use that to think about the justice cascade. So the first thing is that then I did, later in 2011, was this is a book about definitions, emergence of the origins, definitions, origins, and impact. So I just want to talk briefly about those because I think that'll help us segue into the topic of the day, which is the justice cascade over? Okay. And so the definitions question was, this was always about a norms cascade. And here I am a constructivist. You know the definition, norms are standards of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. And so it was about being able to imagine the possibility of prosecuting leaders, right? Because you can't have a norm, a standard of appropriate behavior. What happens first is you have to imagine something. And that's why I give you this period in Argentina between 1981 and 1985. Something happened in that period. Of course, transitions through democracy has a lot of transition scholars that are going to say, of course, it was a transition. Transitions happened, but in the process of these transitions, people moved from not being able to imagine criminally prosecuting their leaders to having the 9 junta members on the dock in Buenos Aires. Okay, so what happened? And I went back later when I'm working this book and I'm talking to these people I know and I'm saying, when did you first ask? Because we see the signs in these demonstrations, la justicia plena, right? We see the signs that emerged at a certain point in Buenos Aires before the transition, in Buenos Aires demonstrations, and it was juicio y castigo a todos los culpables. Okay, we're talking, trials and justice for all the guilty, a very maximalist demand. So how do we get to that maximalist demand? So I started saying, when did you first say that? When did you first feel you could say that? They didn't feel they could say it until after Malvinas, okay? Because what? It was too dangerous to say it before. And then I said, where did that idea come from? And finally, someone sort of said, I think the first mention of trials came in the report that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights made to the Inter-American system. It was the first ever country report that the Inter-American Commission did on Argentina. You read the recommendations and you see that there's a recommendation to prosecute those who are currently prosecuting, those who are responsible. But then I read back and Argentina was not the first mention. It was the first mention came in Chile, a report that the American Commission had done on Chile. And so here there was this global diffusion of some of these ideas that somehow the interactions between Argentine human rights movement, Inter-American Commission had led to this demand for accountability. Now, in terms of, so the first thing I say is the definition was, in the justice cascade, was a cascade of norms. It was a cascade of believing it was possible, appropriate, and even necessary to prosecute. Okay. But as you guys know, it's very hard to measure norms, right? And so when I started working on the Justice Cascade, and I started with colleagues, we said, we can't measure the norm. So we're going to just count trials instead as proxies for the norms. And because I started talking about this, and I say, in Argentina, this is happening. And they say, yeah, colleagues say, yeah, Argentina is happening, but no place else, you know. And so I started, and I was then not, and am not today, really a quantitative scholar, but I started counting trials around the world, the foreign trials, like the Pinochet trials, and others. So first, what was I counting? So there's three, models of accountability. There's the sovereign immunity model, which is, pre-World War II, states and state officials were not held accountable for human rights violations. We can call it the impunity model. It continues today, okay? Whereas there still are many courts in the world, including the International Court of Justice, that believes that the sitting heads of state should not be prosecuted, right? But we've seen from our own Supreme Court that, that there's still a strong doctrine of sovereign immunity of state officials as states. But after World War II, we get a powerful state accountability model. This is almost the entire UN human rights system, right? States are held accountable. Treaty bodies, the UN Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's all about holding states accountable, not state officials. The regional human rights courts, the Inter-American Court, the European Court, the African Court, it's all about holding states accountable, not individuals. So those courts they're post-World War II. The European Court, 1953, the Inter-American system court is in the 80s, gets off. So what's new about Justice Cascade is individual criminal accountability. So the Justice Cascade was always about individual criminal accountability, not about state accountability. Okay, today it's about the ICC, International Criminal Court. It's not about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And this is something, you guys teach, human rights issues too. My students mix up a lot. They think, oh, South Africa v. Israel, that's accountability. Well, that's state accountability. It's old. It's been around for a while. But the ICC and the more recent arrest warrants we've seen on it, both for Israel and Hamas, that's individual criminal accountability. That's what I've been studying. And then we study individual criminal accountability at 3 levels: international prosecutions, the ICC, the hybrid tribunals, the ad hoc tribunals, foreign prosecutions. I told you I started there with Pinochet, and then most importantly, domestic prosecutions. This was where and the issue is the bulk of our data is all about domestic prosecutions. The bulk of the action. We hear lots about the international tribunals. We hear some about these foreign prosecutions, like someone like Pinochet, but the action in terms of numbers is all happening in domestic courts, applying some combination of domestic law and international law. Now, okay, so in terms of that's our definition of the norms cascade, but we measured it counting trials. Okay, and so when you say, is the Justice Cascade over? And I'm going to show you a picture in just a moment. Trials are down. Our new data, which we coded up to 2020, shows it's the peak of the number of trials. These 3 types of trials was peaked in 2010, and it has been declining ever since. We have data through 2020 now. So trials are down. Okay, so if the Justice Cascade is a count of trials, then my title is appropriate. Is the Justice Cascade over? If it's a cascade of norms, then that's a different question, but I still don't know how to measure it. Okay, in the sense that people the way that people are following these arrest warrants from the ICC, the way people are following are making demands around the world, continuing to make demands for justice, suggests that the norms have not disappeared, even as the trials decline. Now, I want to talk briefly more about the origins of the Justice Cascade, because knowing more about the origins may help us know why trials are declining now. Okay, and so first I want to say it didn't start in Argentina. It actually started in, I argue in the Justice Cascade book, it started in Greece and Portugal in the 70s. Okay, the Argentines always like to forget that, you know, and I went to do research in Greece and Portugal and to study the origins. The origins there were unclear too. But the title of that chapter is about navigating without a map. There's no instruction booklet in the 1970s how to do this, right? And so the Portuguese and the Greek are kind of trying to figure it out. And the Argentines, you know, figure it out in high style, you know. And if people gone and seen the Amazon Argentina 1985, so you know that there was really a lot of deep thought about how they were going to do this, but they were inventing things too because they didn't have a model for this. But then finally we were interested in the impact, and half of the book, the Justice Case, is based on the impact issue. I was gathering this data on trials initially just to kind of say to people, see, it's happening. And then when we got the good enough data, I realized, oh, we can use this for analysis to see what difference it makes. And my first co-author on this, who's again was the quantitative expert, was Hanjun Kim, a former graduate student of mine, who's now at University of Korea University. And he and I, 2010, wrote the first article using the new data to try to say, what difference does it make if trials, if we're holding these individual criminal accountability trials? And we used our trial data, we used human rights data from the political terror scale and from the SIRI scales, which were what existed at the time for physical integrity rights. And so it was always about what difference do these trials make for improvements in physical integrity rights, right? And that's because these were trials about physical integrity rights, right? The Argentine trials were about disappearances, murder, and eventually some about rape, though quite late. But and most of the trials were counting, not because we only wanted to count those trials, because that's what people are prosecuting for, was physical integrity. And so we did this, and we did this analysis. We controlled for other things we knew led to human rights violations, and we found for the first time with the 2010 ISQ article that human rights prosecutions were associated with improvements in physical integrity rights. Okay, now that finding, I now have over the last, depending on how you count it, but let's just say 14 years, I've worked with a series of research teams to gather better data, much better data. I've worked with a series of skilled methodologists to use better methods. And that's the one finding over the entire 14 years that has never disappeared from any of the analysis we do. Okay, and that is the finding that human rights prosecutions are associated with improvements in human rights. And we also gathered data on other transitional justice mechanisms, truth commissions, reparations policies, lustration policies, and we also tested those. Already in the Justice Cascade, we were testing truth commissions. And truth commissions is, I worked gathering data with Lee Payne, some of you know Lee, and I had a NSF AHRC grant, 2 rounds of NSF AHRC to build our joint database. So that's why we had much better data. In part because, Lee had been working with another group and my group, and she was finding different things. She was finding that you needed to have prosecutions, amnesty laws, and truth commissions all together in order to get the impact. And I thought that, from our data, I thought that was not right. And so we gathered better data, and we finally ran another ISQ article that Jeff Dancy was the lead author on. And the finding was that human rights prosecutions had an independent, statistically significant effect by themselves on physical integrity rights. So the amnesty law does other things that we can talk about. It was right, the amnesty laws have kind of a weird role to play in all of this. But we confirmed with this better data, this finding. Now, why am I going on about this? Because if human rights prosecutions have consistently had, through our analysis, this effect on human rights violations, then the decline in the justice cascade could be causing problems, right? Because we're not going to see this, what I called, two things we argued, two things are going on: deterrence and socialization. Okay, powerful repressors, we argue, are being deterred. Okay, now that's the causal mechanism. Again, it's very hard in regression analysis to show what's deterrence and what's socialization. Okay, but we argue that these powerful repressors are not socialized, right? But are deterred. The possibility of punishment. The people who gained a lot of political power and economic wealth through repression. As I've said, you don't have to be a rational choice theorist to argue that people for whom repression leads to political and economic benefits and has zero costs, why they might continue to do that. And if you have a cost, that is the possibility, the likelihood of a prosecution, not an actual jail term, but just knowing there may be a cost out there. If the likelihood of prosecution becomes positive sum, then that could have a deterrent effect. But we believe that socialization is important in part, particularly for lower levels of the military. So, the Argentine military, which hasn't showed itself interested in coming back to power, they're looking and they're saying, oh, what happened last time? We'll just let these civilians figure this mess out by themselves. None of this knocking on the doors of barracks again. So we hypothesized both deterrence and socialization for different actors. Okay, this all by the way of so now, why would we expect prosecutors to have a positive impact? They enforce human rights law, they deter or socialize, they help build rule of law. So there's some obvious things why you might expect positive impact. But there's a huge literature, actually, that goes way back to Guillermo O'Donnell, and I want to talk about him here another day. And even O'Donnell, Schmitter, but even earlier Huntington. This particular source is later, but that were really worried about human rights prosecutions. They believed that they could destabilize new democracies, and then they were joined later by some of my IR colleagues, Jack Goldsmith, Stephen Krasner in 2013, and I think most famously, Jack Snyder and Leslie Benjamin in 2000, who literally said, quote, and I quote unquote here, the use or threat of prosecutions could cause more human rights violations than they prevent. Okay, now, this was a big claim, big powerful claim with a big political impact, right? For which they presented, I thought, inadequate evidence. It was case study evidence, some case studies. They were big fans of amnesties laws, but they never showed this to our satisfaction, okay? The even more powerful claim is that prosecutions could interfere with peace processes. And then finally, I think a new one that we're hearing a lot lately is a real preference for restorative justice rather than retributive justice, and the belief that restorative justice is more effective. Okay, so these are issues around impact that are important as we think about this. Now, I have in my slide deck, I have new analysis and data of my research team to talk about all these things. Okay, in the appendix, but I'm not going to talk it today because I'm not going to talk it in my talk because that's not the topic for today, but anyone, and Aniva and Sandra saw them in Mexico City, anyone who wants to talk about it, but we have really good evidence. One, that human rights trials do not worsen human rights. Two, that in fact, they can contribute to the survival of peace after peace agreements. And that restorative justice can also contribute to good outcomes, but it is not more effective than trials. And if you're going to do a mix, that if you don't have trials in the mix, you probably won't get the impact you want. So I'm all in favor, reparations, truth commissions is great. I'm not opposed to restorative justice, but this restorative justice is warm and fuzzy and good, and retributive justice is, you know, an evil retributive state. At least our data does not support that notion, and I'm happy to show you the slides in the Q&A if you want to. Okay. Now, then we continue to build our evidence with the NSF grant, and then for the last 4 years, I've had a grant from the Canadian government, and we built with Jeff Dancy in Toronto, especially Timo Toms and others, built our data set to 2020. And that's when we got a surprise. But first, we have a really nice website, and people should go there. Not now. Transitional data, transitionaljusticedata.org. But in the future, go there because it's data on all these mechanisms for all these countries. And it is a work in progress, and we ask for feedback from country experts. So you're a country expert, you go look, you don't like what you see, you think we've left out stuff or we put in things. There's a place on the website where you can provide feedback and we can respond. Okay, and we've made changes. We've been working with colleagues in Portugal, in Bosnia and elsewhere to make sure we get it right. So the data is downloadable, it's all downloadable free of charge. And this is what happens if you look at the trial data. Okay, this is the combination of domestic, foreign, and international prosecutions peaked in 2010, has been going down ever since. Okay, so that's what leads to my my concern. We just so you know, this is a kind of very rough chart, but this shows you some of our other data. 897 amnesties, 79 reparations program. You know, see the big numbers: 6,146 prosecutions, 117 truth commissions. Okay, and you see they each have their own patterns, but the trial patterns are quite unique in terms of this peak in 2010 and the kind of secular decline. Amnesties decline too, but these amnesty laws are still in effect in many places of the world. Okay, so the new amnesties are going down, but places like Brazil, the Brazil amnesty still alive and well, and the Salvador amnesty and others. And so a lot of these earlier amnesties are still doing work in their countries. And then reparations programs and truth commissions are going up and down, but they don't seem to have the same downward trend. And so that's kind of the question. It's not all transitional justice that is declining its trials, mainly. Okay, I just want to say a few more words about our data. I use the word transitional justice. Our database uses the word transitional justice, but it's actually a database on human rights accountability around the world, not only in transitional societies. So you see we have 58 non-transitional countries, and we have two kinds of transition: democratic transition, intrastate conflict transition from war to peace, and then we have double transition. Now, the reason we did this is we let the users of the database download the data they want. So if you just want democratic transition, you can go to the database, you can select just for democratic transition, you can download that data. If you want just the war data, you can download that data. And so instead of us making decisions about what transitional justice is, we let the researcher make the decisions. Now, we still use transitional justice because if you don't, people don't know what you're talking about. This is another one of those weirdo things. You've got to say transitional justice about a database that has non-transitional countries, because if you say it's a human rights accountability database, which is more correct, they don't know what you're talking about. Okay. Okay. So one of the things that one of the ways that we're approaching right now, trying to explain the decline in the justice cascade, is looking at this question of demand for and supply of justice. And this partly comes out of, okay, you know, when something like this happens to you as a researcher, you go back and read your earlier work and you say, what did I say back then? And so I'm actually going to, I'm going to just read in 2001, with the first mention of it, we said that it was being driven by the rise of repression in Latin America. Okay, the rise of repression in Latin America was leading to what I will now call the demand for justice. Okay, And that's why we're seeing these trials, because there's been a dramatic increase, as we know, during this period of starting in Brazil in the 60s, but especially the 70s and 80s, this period of authoritarianism, then a dramatic increase in Latin America compared to previous times in the 19th century. Okay. But you can have a demand, but unless you have a transition to democracy, and unless you have a rule of law system, you don't get a supply. Okay, and so the unique characteristics of this period of the early justice cascade is that you had big demand as a result of big repression, and that demand was Southern Europe. So it follows the third wave of democracy. Okay, and I say here in 20 I say the third wave of democracy is a necessary condition to explain both the emergence and diffusion of the norm of individual criminal accountability. For these reasons, the spread of the justice norm has been and will continue to be regional and uneven. Because the justice cascade has followed the global wave of democratization, it will not extend to those regions of the world where democratic transitions have not taken root. For example, in the Middle East, or where democratic reversals are occurring, as in Russia and Central Asia. Okay, so we had high repression, then we had transition to democracy, Southern Europe, Latin America, Eastern Europe. Okay, and that's basically where the justice cascade happened. And then the third wave of democracy was over. As all you know, there's no fourth wave, and we have democratic decline. We argue a lot about how much democratic decline, but no one is disagreeing that there is has been a decline in democracy. Okay, and if democracy is, and I believe it is, a precondition for the justice cascade, then maybe this decline is not so surprising. Okay, now it is interesting because there's not a decline, not the same decline for truth commissions and for reparations policies, and it's partly because we believe that some of these electoral democracies and electoral authoritarians, and we see it in our data, are much more willing to have truth commissions and reparations policies than to prosecute. Not a surprise, right? Prosecute. Why would these leaders who don't have rule of law systems, right, agree to subject themselves to any form of individual criminal accountability? If they have demands from their populations, and sometimes they do, for transitional justice, some kind of accountability, they have these other tools, truth commissions, reparations policies, lustration, etc., to try to deliver some kind of justice. So we're working now on hypotheses. I'm starting to put your hypotheses here, you know, that would help explain what's going on. And the first one, and actually Anibal and I talked about this in Mexico, the decline. So one thing is the decline of large repression in the countries where the justice cascade happened has led to a diminished demand for prosecutions, right? Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America. Okay. Now we have the Argentine trials are still going on. There's a handful of trials in Chile, you know, but mainly this big Latin American wave has been completed. Same thing in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe. Okay, where repression is still high, the absence of liberal democracy rule of law make it difficult to hold prosecutions. So that's one of the arguments. And so here's this is the number of liberal democracies, 1970 to 2020. This is VDEM data, but it looks a lot like the justice cascade, you know, in terms of the pattern we see. And so there's a little bit of eyeballing, you know, descriptive statistics eyeballing we've been doing. And we think that this notion that the number of liberal democracies declining is partly helping to explain things. This is number of new trials initiated each year by regime type. So you see all different regime types, except closed autocracies here in the green, are initiating some trials. Okay, but because there are fewer liberal democracies, for various reasons, this decline is going on. But this is interesting because it shows sort of a different pattern, which is that electoral democracies and electoral autocracies were doing trials. We're doing trials and then stopped doing them. So I don't, so there's some things I'm showing you that we don't understand yet, okay? And then I just wanted to end with a few other possible explanations. I already said this one, there's this probably substitution of other TJ policies, such as trials, commissions and reparations policies, and then just some other hypotheses we're playing with, that electoral democracies are less likely to use domestic trials than liberal democracies, but equally or more likely to use truth commissions and reparations policies. And then one thing, some of us thought initially that maybe this was due to the decline in international trials. As you may know, with the initially we had the ICTY, the ad hoc tribunals, the ICTY for Yugoslavia, the ICTR for Rwanda. We had a lot of hybrid tribunals in Cambodia and Sierra Leone, in East Timor. And then when the ICC was set up and when these other tribunals ended, it's just the ICC, it's the only game in town for international tribunals. Now, there was a reason for that. Countries are putting lots of money, your member states are putting lots of money in the ICC. They didn't want to set up a bunch of ad hocs. But we thought maybe the ICC just can't handle all the demand. And maybe this decline in foreign prosecutions too. But when you look at the numbers, here's total and average numbers of trials by type, right? You see all trials, one to your left, right? Domestic trials, you see these numbers are tiny compared to what domestic, it's all driven by domestic trials, basically. And so that it's useful, we were able to just discard certain hypotheses, just looking at, kind of simple, these simple descriptive statistics. So I'm gonna end there because I'm at time. But I very much welcome your comments, your questions about any aspects of this, and your suggestions as well. This is the great thing of presenting the work in progress, is you really can take advantage of suggestions as well. So thank you very much.
Who would like to begin? Which?
No, thank you. That was pretty helpful. Really like so many thoughts. You said two different things about norms in the thought that you started. I would agree more with one of them. So in the beginning you said that trial to be a proxy for norms, but then you said that trial works with different mechanisms to create deterrence, socialization, right? The latter view of norms seems to me a more convincing one, at least more in line with the literature. But so then, if that's the case, then I would expect reasons why, even if norms have been successfully installed, you expect trials to go down, right? Because first, because the mechanisms interact, right? So if you deter people, then a norm is passed on, there is peer pressure, people are socializing to these norms, so then you don't need trials to communicate norms. So, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the case, but I would just perhaps think maybe in a more kind of systematic way about what trials are indicating on the presence of norms. And then in tandem with that, it would be interesting to look at other ways of looking at norms, like survey data, right? Like there is a lot of data now, LAPOC, Latinobarometer, right? There are elite surveys, right? Like that's a very direct way. It's imperfect, but quite direct, getting norms. And the second comment, I'm also curious about your thoughts on this, but about the ability to maintain and communicate norms under democracy, right? So norms now are constructed in a contested way under democracy, right? So I'm influenced by the Argentine case, obviously here, but as the last batch of trials during the Kirchner governments, were adopted, it was much more contested, right? Because independent of what you think about the behavior of the government and the human rights organization, it's inevitable that the other side is going to perceive that there is bias in how norms are imposed, right? So there is difficulty in passing norms during democratic contestation. So there is actually perhaps an advantage to the processes that happen early on, right? It's much easier to see the very early on, the ones that we saw in Argentina 1985 movie being consensual than being done right now. So I'm curious about whether part of the reason why perhaps the cascade is going down is that there is a paradoxical effect of democracy, that it makes norms contested, and then you can have governments that actually push back and pass on their own interpretation. So those are two different ideas, right? So it could be that norms go, it's not norms go down, it's just trials are not capturing that, and the second one is that perhaps democracy paradoxically struggles to actually continue to implement and sanction norms.
Wow, okay, lots going on in those questions. Let me see if I can go one by one. So in terms of deterrence and socialization, so when I started working in deterrence, I turned to the deterrence literature, which is big in the United States sociology, okay? And I learned that there's the deterrence it divides between two things. One is the likelihood of punishment, and the second is the severity of punishment. Okay, and a lot of the US sociology literature is focused almost solely on severity because it's an anti-death penalty literature. Okay, and it makes the point that the severity of punishment, i.e. this death penalty, doesn't deter. Okay, but when you look, it turns out there's another literature on the likelihood of punishment, and there's much more support that the likelihood of punishment does deter. Likelihood, not severity. Okay, but these are people working within a domestic, they're studying domestic judicial systems where there's never a zero likelihood of punishment, virtually never, okay? And so in some ways, the international arena, okay, or the state impunity model that existed was this kind of really interesting thing, because literally state officials prior to the 70s had a zero likelihood of punishment of human rights violations in their government. Okay, so we moved in the international system from a zero likelihood of punishment to some positive sum, and that positive sum varied by country. Okay, it varied by country. So there's many countries in the world where you still have a zero likelihood of punishment, and there's others where you have some kind of positive sum. Okay, so I just wanted to say, I don't think that's going to help me with the decline of the justice cascade, because there's too much variation I think it's the likelihood of punishment that causes deterrence, but that's too much variation by country. And to help me understand the global decline. Does that make sense? Second, survey data. Two members of my team I haven't mentioned yet. I've mentioned Jeff Dancy, but my two other main PIs are Fung Pham and Patrick Vink. They are the leading survey researchers in the world doing survey research in post-conflict societies. Okay, post-conflict, they're post-conflict surveys. And some of their data is up on the website, you can find it. They have done surveys of more than 200,000 people in, I think, 22 different post-conflict societies. Most recently, they just completed one in Ethiopia, 6,000 people in Ethiopia in 10 different regions of Ethiopia, with fascinating results that show dramatic differences, regional differences. The people in Tigray asked about justice, all want an international tribunal because they completely don't trust the central government, but people elsewhere don't. So I have access to fantastic survey data, and it's possible, and we should be, digging more in. What we find surprisingly is high levels of support for trials and truth commissions and reparations policies among groups in these societies. So there can be differences. I want domestic trials, you want foreign trials, but we do not find in all this survey, we do not find a marked preference only for restorative justice. And so the odd thing is restorative justice is is really more of a kind of trendy thing in the global north, okay, more than a true statement of what victims want in the global south. And it's due to this incredibly punitive society that we live in this country. They think, oh, we live in the carceral state society that's incredibly punitive. I oppose retributive justice. They don't say, we live in a world that used to have zero accountability for state officials that carried out mass atrocity, and now we have some positive sum. It's different than one's natural concern about the carceral state. Okay, that. Thirdly, so democratic contestation. You'll recall that very early on, the debate about transitional justice had to do with pacted versus ruptured. transitions. And I know O'Donnell and others weren't. And initially that was a really good explanation. It was, if Argentina had a ruptured transition, the Falklands War, the power cannot be, the previous regime could not exercise, could not control the conditions of the transition, and they could not block the justice. We get the trials. The Chileans had a pacted transition, the Uruguayans had a pacted transition. And same thing, you know, Portugal and Greece. Why early trials there? Ruptured transition. Cyprus in the Cyprus War for Greece, the revolution in Portugal. Okay, Spain had a pacted transition. To this day, nothing. Okay, almost nothing in Spain. And so that was a very useful thing. And so it, but it just shows that there was always contestation. There was always contestation. That contestation was if you were to move quickly like Argentina could, you could take advantage of your ruptured transition. But contestation was going to reemerge. There's all of these countries, you know, when you study them, all of these countries have lots of contestation. You know, the Chileans, which have had many trials now, you know, don't like ex post facto application of law. The Chileans are saying these are things that were, you know, these were kidnappings. The statute of limitations has passed. We should not be prosecuting. We should not be prosecuting just for legal reasons. The Uruguayans say it too, for that matter. You know, and so the Chilean judiciary is doing something called a media prescripción. You know, because they think that the principles of legality are being violated by not respecting statute of limitations. So I'd say bunch of contestation, some of it very valid from a legal point of view. But I'm not sure that that's new or different.
Yeah.
I have a question from our online audience.
Oh,
As a scholar who thinks about norms and norm change, I'm very sympathetic to the conundrum you face regarding how to measure norms. Can you say more about what precise norm you are trying to measure now and why you think trials were a good measure in the past? Was this essentially a behavioral school choice, or was there a different logic? I think it would be that.
right. No, exactly. So what's the norm? The norm is state officials who participate or order mass atrocity should be held criminally accountable. That's the norm. It takes that should thing, which is the norm, you know. So the standard of appropriate behavior is that states should hold state officials criminally accountable in a court of law for mass atrocity. Okay. So in terms of, yeah, and so how, but that is, so the norm is they should be held accountable. What I'm measuring behaviorally is they are held accountable, right? And so the number that are being held accountable is going down. But attitudes about whether people should be held accountable, I mean, just listen on our campuses to what's going on with Israel-Palestine. You know, I don't know what it is like here, but I promise you at Harvard, you know, the bulk of my students firmly hold this norm that state officials who engage in mass atrocity should be held accountable. And not only that, they are just angry, furious that it's not happening. Okay. And so it's possible that the norm is still strong and even strengthening, at least for certain situations where the number of prosecutions is actually declining.
Well,
Thank you so much. This is super fascinating. I mean, to some extent, what you're observing is what I would expect. If you have a norm cascade, you should eventually see the number of trials going down because this becomes the deterrence model is actually working and not something hypothetical. But I was wondering, thinking of your data and you think about democracies, the nature of repression in democracies is different than in authoritarian regimes. You don't see the types of mass atrocities that are centralized in the same way in democracies. What you see is more other forms of state repression that are more decentralized, for example, police violence.
Mm-hmm.
So what type of data are you including in these trials? For example, are you including trials of police officers who are engaging in human rights violations, but these forms of human rights violations are not what we would see in Argentina in the 70s, right? Because in that case, you might actually be seeing missing some form of trials that are actually happening. And just to give you an idea, like in Argentina, there's not very good information about the trials of police prosecutions, but police who engage in human rights violations now are more likely to be prosecuted, say, than even in the United States. So that there's a legacy there of these justice cascades, but it's just we're looking at different forms of repression nowadays, and maybe just looking at these big mass atrocities in democracies, we're just not going to find them.
So so I gave you the norm, but the actual definition for what we code these are human rights prosecutions, okay? And so, human rights prosecutions involve state violations by state officials at any level, not just high level, and they can be police violence. In fact, we have a lot of prison guard and police officer prosecutions in the data set, not only high level people. We do divide the data by high ranking, low ranking. It turns out if high ranking trials are there, you get a bigger impact. Okay, but you don't only get the impact from high ranking trials. So I was surprised the number of trials when I go back and look that are not the kind of classic ones that I'm presenting here, not the Pinochets, not the trials of the juntas, but are police officers. And I recently recoded, we recoded for gender violence, and we're picking up, rape and sexual abuse in prisons. An example actually is a trial that was, an odd example, but it's in the database, is a trial of a police officer for extra dereliction of duty because he fails to intervene when people on the street are beating up a trans individual. Okay, so even though the trials for dereliction of duty, we see there's a human rights issue at stake here, and we include it in the database.
Yes. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted you're here. I really enjoyed learning more about your work, and especially our conversation today about the relationship between prosecutions and specific norms. I think is especially interesting. It seems to me that two types of data would be especially useful to sharpen that conversation. And you mentioned that you are acquiring data of improved quality, and I wonder if you have this data already. So one is, a lot of the discussion was about the number of cases, right? And do we know how many of these court cases have actually resulted in convictions of guilty individuals? Because that would, I think, tell us something interesting about whether, do we think about this accountability norm as just having a court case against those we think are guilty, or actually trying to secure an adverse ruling against them. And then second, in terms of why there might be a decline in the number of these cases, can we, do you know what the reasons are at the micro level? That is, are fewer cases brought by various groups, individuals? And if so, is it because they have fewer resources? Is it because they think that the judiciary is stacked by illiberal individuals that would not rule in favor of these human rights organizations? Is it because these cases are brought to domestic courts, but these courts rule them inadmissible? So do we know what's going on at that fine-grained level? Because that, again, would give us a better sense of whether there's a norm regress, a norm debt, what's going on.
Yeah, a terrific question. So the trial data we get is about the whole process of prosecution, okay? So some people have gathered this, they've only looked at cases that get to convictions, okay? We believe the whole process of prosecution might be important, and we include that, but we do, when it's possible to get it, we do have conviction data, okay? And we even have some sentencing data, but we can't always get it. It's hard. And because it means you're having to follow cases through the legal system. Each legal system, as you know, is quite different. You know, I'm learning more about courts of cassation and, you know, who appeals and which countries said appeal has to go to the Supreme Court, which countries it doesn't. It's almost a coding nightmare, but we are trying to do this to get microdata. So we have stuff on convictions, but not for all of our cases. We have high level, low level, and those are two things. And yes, if you get a conviction, if you have more convictions, and if you convict more high level people, the impact is stronger, but it doesn't disappear. It doesn't exist only for high level, only for convictions. Okay. So the fine grained stuff, you know, there's ways we need to dig into the data more to understand it. But one way we're digging, I didn't mention because there's a lot of fine grained legal stuff in here. And one thing that we have found evidence for the past, the reason Latin America has one reason Latin America has so many tribes is because they have a judicial tool called la figura de querella. Okay, querellante. So and what it means in English. So no English translation. It took me 6 months to find an English translation of this word. Okay, and so I mean seriously, this is how hard it is because we're translating legal systems, not just okay. It is called in English private prosecution in criminal cases. Now, you can put that in most US lawyers don't know what you're talking about because they say there's no, and people, I would interview people in Latin America and they say, you know, the querellante is doing this, querellante is doing that. I read plaintiff, and all of a sudden I'm going, these are criminal cases that don't have plaintiffs in the US. No, because Latin American systems permit individuals with their lawyers, often their lawyers are NGOs, and this are the human rights NGOs, can accompany the public prosecutor to trial. And where you have a strong private prosecuting system like Argentina, the private prosecutor can push when the public prosecutor wants to drop the case. And that is a good predictor of where you see more cases, okay? Because the victims participate in criminal trials, okay? So that is one micro level thing that we continue to see has importance. We get more trials in countries that have this private prosecution.
Thanks, Kathryn. Paulo Carazza. So one of the things that I always thought was fascinating about your norm cascade work, justice cascade work, was not just the question of diffusion, like how the norms diffuse across legal systems, both horizontally from country to country and also vertically between regional, international, and domestic. And a lot of what you're talking about today is focused more on what's happening within the countries.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so how does your thinking about what's happening now connect to what thought you've been given about diffusion? And to be slightly more specific about it, I mean, so why are countries not imitating one another in the way that they were in the earlier phase horizontally? And vertically, why is it the case, do you think, that like in the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Commission, the Inter-American Court continue to insist on prosecutions in many of their cases, and many of those prosecutions are not happening. And so what, you know, it was interesting that you resurrected the early Chilean report and then the Argentine report, that the idea begins with the Inter-American Commission, right? Why is the dynamic that vertical dynamic seem weaker now?
Well, excellent points. So one thing is, as this moves to different regions, okay, I'm arguing, okay, that there's kind of a diffusion pattern. I mean, I'm arguing that repression is appearing today in different regions than it did back in the 70s and 80s, okay? And that in those regions, which are less democratic, there has not been as much diffusion, okay? But I'm also saying that, you know, countries, leaders, there is a dictator's learning curve here, or there's an electoral democracy learning curve. So, you know, there's a couple of decades here, governments are learning, right? Like with the ICC, let's say, which is one part of this, the Kenya case is crucial. What did the Kenyan I think they'd be called electoral democracy, is Kenya electoral democracy or is it electoral authoritarian? Anyway, they learned that if you threaten witnesses, you can get them to withdraw their testimony. And if they withdraw their testimony, the ICC can't move ahead. That was the secret, the dirty secret of the Kenyan case. The ICC backed off because they lost their witnesses, and they lost their witnesses because the Kenyan government threatened them and threatened their families. Okay, so other things are diffusing. They're just not just ideals of justice, but the practical policies that states can use to try to lessen the justice cascade. Okay. The Inter-American system I think is continuing to do good work here. There's a couple of countries like Brazil and El Salvador that have ignored the amnesty laws, but the big cases, we have big cases of repression, Venezuela, but they're not countries that are going to prosecute. Venezuela, El Salvador, Nicaragua are not cases where the supply is available, right? And so the Inter-American Court can't do something with regard to Venezuela or El Salvador or Nicaragua right now. It shouldn't surprise us. The supply is not there of justice. There's the conditions for the supply of justice, it just isn't there.
I have a lot of hands. Let's hear from Laura Lopez, and I have Mike Davis and Laura Gamboa and Rashid.
Thank you for the talk. I have a reaction to your hypothesis about the demand side. That you say that it's more difficult to hold prosecutions in countries where there is no legal democracy, and I agree. I just have a reaction on how there could be another explanation to this in some countries where there is where there are criminal conflicts going on, like in Latin America, Mexico, some countries in Central America, and maybe a rising issue in Peru. That these criminal conflicts make the definition of state agents participating in human rights violations less evident or less clear-cut as it could be in authoritarian regimes. And this complicates the understanding, of course, of what a human rights violation is. That could be an explanation of why we are seeing, or you could be measuring less of this in countries experiencing this like more complicated definition of where the state is allowing for violence against the population is an issue that has been raised by, for example, relatives of disappeared persons in Mexico, arguing that it is not only, it is the concept, for example, of forced disappearances is not enough to understand what's going on, and the collusion of some state agents and their participation in this type of violence against the population. So it's a reaction to this demand side, and I don't know if you had any thoughts on this.
Thank you for that. I mean, as I said, a number of us were just in Mexico, and one of the reports we heard was that there's 117,000 disappeared. Now, they also told us that list is not broken down at all by states, non-state criminal groups, or people who just get kind of lost, which, every country has people who just get lost, let's say, lose themselves, whatever. And so they can't even give, so we don't know what percentage of that is the Mexican state disappearing people, right? And so it is true that a situation like Mexico, and I think particularly a situation where drug gangs are involved, is uniquely difficult to identify. Now, sometimes we look in the past when we say it was easy in the past and now it's hard, okay? But all of us who went through watching what was happening in places like Argentina realized that it was extremely difficult for first the human rights organizations and later the justice system to reconstruct what had happened with the disappearances. It was it was years where people initially did not know these were state-sponsored disappearances. Eventually, an incredible reconstruction was done, but it took immense effort. We know in the case of Colombia, the paramilitaries, there was a huge issue around paramilitaries. What was the relation to the state? Eventually, it was possible to reconstruct that and hold trials of paramilitaries. And now, of course, the trials of the HIP involving FARC, So I think there is something uniquely difficult about getting these drug groups involved, these criminal organizations, as opposed to kind of ordinary paramilitary groups. But I'm not always sure it was, we look at the Peruvian Truth Commission, they sorted out a lot in terms of criminality, in terms of armed groups and who was responsible in a way that eventually was able to say that there were more, Sendero Luminoso was responsible for more deaths in Peru than the Peruvian government, and I think it can be with sufficient will and energy, it can be sorted. And that will is not there in Mexico today, if that's what you're asking. I agree. As far as we can, that's what I took away. I know Sandra and Aníbal, you think that truly the political will is not there. It has not been, it's still not there to sort it out. Yeah, thank you.
Rashid?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just have two questions, just because I wanted a bit more clarity on this issue. Do we know if the rates of the criminal cases occurring are comparable to the rates of like human rights violations in the past? Because I think from the plots, you're using the absolute numbers of cases, absolute number of trials. And I wonder if this could also be, the decline could be because there aren't many cases compared to the past, or do you think that the cases are relatively equal, but we're seeing fewer trials? Because I imagine once you transition, there's probably improvement in democracy and all that. And so you might not be having the same levels of violation that you observe in the past. And so perhaps as a ratio, then it could be that the number is declining, but the ratio of prosecution might actually be higher. So that is number one. And the second one, and just for clarity, and I'm sure that you have the answer for this probably, is relating to democracy being a precondition for having like good the improved human rights and all that. But if that is the case, how do we rule out that democratization was inevitably not leading to fewer violations in the first place? Or and rather it is a persecution that improves the conditions.
Okay. So there's a quantitative literature on human rights causes and human rights violations. And we know that democracy is independently a feature that leads to fewer human rights violations. So when we do our research, we always control for democracy, and democracy is always statistically significant. So you're absolutely correct. Democracy itself contributes to lower human rights violations. Okay, but when we introduce trials into that equation, trials controlling for democracy have an independent and a statistically significant effect on the outcome. Okay, now the issue about numbers is really complicated because there's some countries that have Uruguay or Chile or whatever, where you have pretty good data and you can say these human rights violations of the 70s are unprecedented in 20th century history, at least. Okay, there's the records are good enough. You just say there's nothing like this in terms of number of dead or disappeared or imprisoned or tortured people in those countries. There's other countries, more turbulent kind of histories, but where the true numbers are hard to find. True numbers, and the paradox here, and I tried to do this because I do believe that countries that had more dead had more prosecutions. There was more demand for prosecutions. with more dead or disappeared. And I tried to get absolute numbers. And Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Peru, I was trying to get absolute numbers, and then you can get percentage of as a population, okay? But the paradox is you only get good absolute numbers when you've had an excellent truth commission, right? And so it's this odd thing. You need transitional justice to finally get a good count. But we are working, and this is more than you want to know. So we'll talk about it, maybe we can talk afterwards. I mean, because we're working on something called a Human Rights Accountability Index, where we get a single number of human rights accountability in a country. But in order to do that, you need to have you need to have a notion of legacy of violence. And we are borrowing from sources to get a legacy of violence measure for all the countries in our sample.
Laura Gamboa?
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Kind of touching on some of the questions that have been made. I was wondering to what extent the end of the Cascade has to do with democratic backsliding, right? Like the wave of autocratization. And I'm thinking about 4 mechanisms. First, autocrats have changed the way they violate human rights. They do this using the levers of democracy, and sort of they change their repertoire so they get harder to file. We also see less independent judiciaries, but also more timid judiciaries, less willing to challenge sort of strong executives, and perhaps less imaginative, right? Like less willing to envision new norms and stuff like that. I'm also thinking about autocrats or autocratic coalitions that might have stopped some of the trials, like what happened in Guatemala. And also was thinking about misinformation and how it can mud the debate of how we think about a human rights abuse, right? Like kind of diminishing the public outrage for these violations.
Well, I think I already said that I do believe that democratic decay is part of what explains going on here. That I think autocrats have changed the way they violate, but again, this is kind of like one of the things that I recall vividly from the Chile-Argentina issue, right? Is the Chileans murdered people in this stadium, right? There were public executions in the stadium. It went on national news. It went viral internationally in the old viral, right? But it went. And the Argentine, we have that the Argentines spoke about the fact that they had to change the way they violated rights. And the disappearance was an innovation that was trying to avoid the condemnation for public executions that happened in Chile. And it initially succeeded. But then the disappearances became the focus, right? The new focus. And this disappearance has been, an innovation that's been used, now effectively by many, many governments, right? The misinformation, we know we're in a misinformation environment, but there was terrible misinformation during these military regimes. And people who lived in Argentina at the time remember how many years it took them to figure out that the state was disappearing people and to have some idea where they were taken. I remember when the first very rough diagrams of the campos de concentración were being done because people had been released and they were trying. So misinformation was a characteristic of these repressive regimes too. They didn't have social media and other ways to do it, but I don't think it's new. Timid. So I just want to say everything you said is true, but not new.
Mike Davis has been on the list for a bit.
Just a question about if a country becomes more established as a democracy and has the rule of law, is most justice related to human rights shifted from prosecuting officials to being raised by defendants who are being prosecuted? And I wonder if that's something is there an inverse relationship between the decline of official prosecutions, but people can raise it as a defendant? They can raise a human rights violation, and this is a matter of justice as well. most prominently this week, Jimmy Lies, raising all kinds of human rights claims when he's the one that's being prosecuted. But what's revealed in that is that these officials are misbehaving and overreaching with human rights violations. So is that part of this research to look at how human rights are addressed in the justice system, not just in prosecuting and holding people accountable, but as defendants, and maybe no one will be prosecuted.
So we are looking at human rights prosecutions, by which we mean, and we define human rights prosecution as prosecutions of state officials or in situations of war, armed groups. Okay, so we're not looking at show trials, we're not looking at mistreatment, we're not looking at all miscarriage of justice in the world. We're looking at human rights prosecutions. So there's lots of miscarriage of justice, you're absolutely right. But that's not in our, we're trying to list things that we have reason to believe are some kind of genuine human rights prosecution. Now, do things happen? Do sometimes these state officials who are being prosecuted have justice claims? So we had this whole debate over the Romanian, the Ceausescu, when it's not like you put the Ceausescus into a room, you have an hour-long discussion, you take them out in line against the wall and shoot them. That doesn't count for our database. They were mass violators of human rights, but there was a travesty of justice in their trials, and it doesn't appear in our database. Okay, so we're trying to walk a fine line here to code human rights prosecutions, but not not the old style political trials that still happen in the world today.
Abby?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. So I have been thinking in some larger questions, or I guess related, but so I want to hear from you. So why do norms appear to break down despite the socialization effects? So why do we see like these cascades, going up, but then in this case, a reversal, particularly if socialization is at work? And so, and even more so, I wonder if the breakdown of norms might actually be at the root of democratic backsliding, right? So I think that there is some confounding language in the sense that, yeah, like democratic backsliding involves human rights violation, but if those norms, broke, then you have authoritarian leaders with authoritarian tendencies more inclined to go all the way down and not prosecute and so on, right? So I guess it's I don't want to say a question of causality, but thinking about the argument, if there is some socialization going on, how is that we got here?
So in my article with Martha Finnemore on the norm dynamics, we say no new norm enters an empty norm space. New norms enter an area already dense with existing norms. So, and we use our historical example, but when the when the women's suffrage movement emerged, women should vote, it entered a space that was already normatively dense about the appropriate behavior was that women didn't vote and men voted. That was the norm of the time. And little funny things happen when you study norm campaigns. Early suffragists advocated that only spinsters and widows should get the right to vote. And you go like, what's that about? And it's because married women were being represented by their husbands. Okay, and what you realize, it was a different normative world where an activist for suffrage could say it's appropriate for married women to be represented by their husbands, but these poor spinsters and widows don't have anyone representing them and they should vote. So we forget how odd the norm landscape was when this norm change begins. So I just want to say, there's what we would call good norms and bad norms. But a norm is a standard of appropriate behavior. So at the time it exists, some people believe it's a good norm. Some people believe it was good that women didn't vote. You know, I think in Saudi
Some
Arabia.
people still believe
Saudi
that.
Arabia today. Switzerland gave the vote to women in 1971 at a national level. So there's always, norms are always breaking down as new norms enter. It's a constant norm breakdown, okay? And so, but the question you're asking is, you know, with all this democratic backsliding, you know, do we have good, so-called good norms, the ones we think are appropriate, that are breaking down and being replaced by bad norms that we think are bad, okay? And I think, yes, the political struggles in the world are often very struggles about norms. I mean, you know, abortion is a norm struggle. And people on both sides are engaged in transnational, you know, advocacy networks around norms that they deeply believe in. And so sometimes you get true norm clashing. You know, so we can get into things, you know, our norms of how, do have norms in the United States about the political discourse of our elites changed? Yes. And, you know, so just, there's this odd issue that norms are about appropriate behavior, but for any one group of individuals or individual, there are, you know, there are the norms we like and the norms we don't like, but that doesn't mean there aren't norms out there.
We usually close at about 1:50. It's a couple minutes past that, but I think there's one person who's been hoping to speak for a while. So
Okay.
I think we'll make this the last question or comment, with apologies to others who would like to intervene, but time is marching on. Go ahead, please.
Nicholas Vitragoa, PhD student in the law school. I have asked more questions about how do you think that the difference within, you know, like counting cases and making cases count to, I don't know if you make that sort of difference, because I was checking the data of Colombia and it goes with this example of the judicial cascade, but the recent cases that are open in Colombia are the macro cases of the head that have more than 3,000 perpetrators being prosecuted by case. And I mean, I don't know if you also have the data of how many perpetrators are being prosecuted by case, to know that there are some cases that will have broader impact than others, in which maybe only one state official or perpetrator will come on.
We are aware of the macro cases that it exists in both Argentina and Colombia. We haven't found them in other countries. Okay, they're called the mega causas in Argentina, and they create a little bit of problem for our data. But we do break data down by the trial and the accused, and so we have a count that's both counted trials and accused, and that should help us not lose the individuals in the macro cases. And so we're aware of it. We're trying to address it. I think that's not the explanation for the decline, but thank you for raising it, because it's very unique what's happening with these mega causas. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for coming, for great questions and comments, and to Kathryn for a wonderful talk and for joining us here today.
My pleasure. The day before, I mean, the obvious thing, but still, everyone's trying to, yeah, exactly.